You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 56. Karyne watched Daisy and the stranger from across camp, unsure whom to keep a closer eye on. What if Kendallin was right about Daisy? What if she traveled with these people, biding her time until she could join her aunt and rule alongside her with blood magic? Maybe that was the real reason she'd released the dragon. He shook away the terrifying image. It couldn't be possible. But if she hadn't done blood magic, that meant the stranger was more dangerous than he looked. None of the healers in LNS could pull off that kind of work, especially not on themselves. And where was the man's starlock? Lukai finished healing the silent stranger's wounds, and Iris fussed over Daisy, brushing and braiding her hair while giving lots of loud opinions on Silmar's wisdom in sending her out in the first place. Daisy winced at the woman's rough treatment, but still smiled, as if she knew it had been triggered by fear. Karyne busied himself by training Gullet with the newest charm he'd added to his starlock's cord. The wooden sphere directed Gullet to Enla, and the block to Riverin, but the roughly star-shaped wooden bead he'd added was intended to guide Gullet to Daisy. Karyne had had to steal a lock of her hair in the night to train the dumb bird, but as Gullet pecked the bead and then hopped over to Daisy, relief rushed through Karyne. It was working. After losing her once, he refused to lose her again. He told himself it was because he needed to keep track of potential threats, but he knew that was a lie, especially after the panic that had infused him when the stranger said the arrow had been trained on Daisy. She reached out to pet Gullet, who squawked his appreciation, and when her face lit up with joy, a foreign sense of longing rose inside him. Earning a look like that would be worth 5 of Lenda's insincere smiles. Falk sat at the edge of camp even after Daisy urged him to come closer. His eyes darted between Silmar and Daisy, as if Silmar were some sort of alpha male who needed to welcome Falk back into the pack. While the others gathered for the midday meal, Karyne stopped by Falk, passing him a stick with fish and a serving of flatbread. Falk hesitated, unable to hold Karyne's gaze. "Go on," Karyne said. Falk grabbed the food, then turned away, sitting on his haunches and picking at the food. "Thank you for coming back," Karyne said. Falk stiffened, but didn't reply. 11 days into the moon's cycle, he was like a full-grown man approaching middle age, with sinewy muscles and a wide jaw. But something about the way he curled around himself still made him seem like a child. "Eliana's been sad without you. It's not your fault you fought in a past life. I shouldn't have shown you that. What matters is how you are in this life, and you've been a good friend to her."
"The other Winnecks don't have mamas,"
Falk said, his brow furrowing in confusion. Karyne sighed. "Maybe if they did, more of them would be like you."
"I don't belong with them, not anymore."
Karyne glanced back at the others. "Do you want to belong with them? Or with us?"
"I want to belong with with Eliana."
Falk turned his back to Karyne and cut off the conversation. When Karyne returned to the fire, where the others still circled around to cook more fish, the group was unusually somber. Jasperus and Holm excused themselves to rest up before night watch, while the rest discussed trivial things like the food and weather, their eyes always coming back to rest on the stranger. Silmar still ate, likely waiting until after the meal for the interrogation, but Karyne was done waiting. "So what's your name?" Karyne asked, sitting near the stranger. The man went rigid, gaze frozen on his food. I'm not sure." Silmar frowned and set down his plate.
Where are you from?
Lukai and Velden exchanged wary glances, and Karyne glanced at Riveren's equally suspicious expression. Was the man an enemy the others didn't recognize? Did that make him a friend or enemy of Karyne's? Karyne was beginning to wonder if he knew half of what went on in his family's palace. My memories are all jumbled in my mind. The man set his flatbread down on his knee, rubbing his arms even though it wasn't the least bit cold. I can't grasp any of them. The first thing I remember is waking up in a cave. It glowed with lights in varying colors, like a rainbow lighting the room. When I turned to see the backs of at least 10 sprites, I also caught glimpse of them pushing a young woman outside the cave. Karyne turned toward Daisy, who choked a bit on her fish, unable to take in the rest of the party's accusing looks.
Eliana?
Lukai's voice came out with a growl.
Yes, they pushed me, she said, and I was fine. I didn't see him in the cave, but that doesn't mean he wasn't there. It was too dark to see beyond the sprites' bright lights.
Silmar grunted, and Karyne suspected she'd be hearing a lot about heightening her awareness during her next lesson with the overbearing mentor.
I couldn't remember who I was or what I was doing, the man continued, but I had a compulsion to follow you, to make sure you were all right.
The sprites let you pass? Karyne asked, unable to hide his skepticism. After they'd pushed her to her death? Riveren shook his head, the X on his forehead glinting in the sunlight. But Karyne wasn't sure if Riveren had trouble believing the sprites had let the man pass, or if he was warning Karyne not to give away their experience. The stranger shrugged. They parted for me as if they'd expected it. One even said, "Your time has come." I ran down the path, watching for Daisy? Several pairs of eyes turned in Karyne's direction, and his cheeks went hot. Had he called her that out loud in front of the stranger? Eliana, Lukai corrected, scooting closer to her. The older man took in the exchange with amusement, which gave him a point in Karyne's favor. I watched for Eliana to surface. When I saw her drag the young man to the shoreline, I slowed, thinking I'd overreacted. But the compulsion only became stronger, urging me to help her.
You healed Cyrus, didn't you? Eliana said.
No. The man held up his hands, shaking them as if to wave off her conclusion. By the time I got there, you had already done that, nearly killed yourself in the process.
But then you saved her life, Cyrus prompted, with magic.
The man hesitated. I suppose so. It felt instinctual, but I don't really know what I did. I can't recall having done it before. He stared at the soil, digging the toe of his boot at the root of a small fern.
Why did you leave?
Silmar asked. I panicked. I didn't know who I was. I felt too vulnerable, and instinct made me run. Where's your starlock? Karyne asked. The man frowned. Those are the charms that enhance magic, right? Karyne held back an eye roll. The story was beginning to smell worse than the fish Velden had caught. Do I have one of those? The man patted down the fresh cloak Lukai had given him, coming up empty. Iris stood with a huff, joining Jasperus and Holm at the bedrolls. Even Daisy's face held wariness at the false sense of innocence.
Memory loss is a convenient story.
Silmar crossed his arms over his chest.
It allows you to keep your past loyalties secret while digging for information from us.
The stranger winced. Are we at war? Velden shrugged. Of sorts, or we're about to be in one. I don't know where my loyalties lie, the stranger admitted.
I would like to think the compulsion to save the young woman means my loyalties lie with her, but I can't blame you for not trusting me, not if there's a war.
I've never even met you. How could your loyalties lie with me?
Daisy asked. None of you recognize me? They all shook their heads, and he slumped. That doesn't automatically make you an enemy, Karyne said, surprised at his own words. I don't recognize you either, and they consider me an enemy. The stranger glanced around the circle, and Karyne tried not to be bothered by the fact that no one argued with his statement. He sought out Aura, who quietly took in the whole scene from just outside the circle. Outside of her story the night before, she'd reverted back to her preferred status of not interfering, which Karyne found inconvenient most days.
Have you been following us ever since that night, even with Durakan's attack?
Daisy asked. The man nodded, his gaze going back to the dirt. If all that's true, why did you attack Eliana just now? Karyne asked. The stranger winced again, glancing at her. I didn't attack you. I saw the other woman aiming for us. You said you didn't come with guards, so I assumed her sights were on you. It was hard to tell in the firelight, but Karyne swore Kendallen's cheeks turned pink. Had the other woman been aiming for Daisy? Or the stranger?
Well,
Eliana said,
you either have terrible eyesight or Kendallen has terrible aim. Except I've seen her with a bow. She wouldn't have hit you unless you were her target.
The man grunted his assent, but Karyne still didn't relax. That same compulsion came over me to protect you, the man said. And selfishly, I needed you alive to get answers for why that compulsion even exists.
Why were you following us anyway?
Daisy asked Kendallen. When Kendallen glanced at Silmar, he answered for her. We knew our group was being followed. We hoped to draw out our pursuer if it seemed you were mostly alone. Karyne flexed his fingers into fists. You used her as bait? It was the only way to make sure we either lost our tail or trapped him before entering open land. Silmar's face hardened without remorse. Better to be bait on our own terms than in unknown circumstances. Besides, it worked.
Well, now that you've caught him, what will you do?
Daisy asked, her irritation evident in the tightness around her mouth. Karyne understood why they didn't trust him with any of their plans, but they could have at least told Daisy for her own protection. Silmar rubbed at his beard, considering. Kendallen? Her name came out like a question, but everyone else knew it was a command. Well, everyone except the stranger. Kendallen stood, sliding past Karyne. You're Kendallen? The stranger squirmed.
Just because I shot you doesn't mean I'll use my magic to hurt you.
She kneeled next to him. I guess I don't have much choice either way. The stranger smiled, but he watched Kendallen too closely to truly be at ease. He placed his hand in her open palm. She closed her eyes, and the others all leaned in a fraction closer, including Karyne. As Kendallen sifted through the stranger's soul and weighed through his intentions, Karyne also tuned in to the man's memories. He watched them in reverse, the man keeping to himself while maintaining a close proximity to the group. Even the memories surrounding Lover's Falls held nothing different from what he'd said. Without warning, the memories cut off like shards of glass. Images of the stranger at various ages splintered across Karyne's mind, the chaos of the memories painful. He sucked in a breath just as Kendallen's jaw went slack and her eyes opened wide. She dropped the stranger's hand and scooted away. Karyne leaned back, grasping his temple as if he needed to keep his own memories from splintering the way the stranger's had. Daisy narrowed her eyes at him, far more interested in his reaction than in Kendallen's. What? Silmar asked. What is it? Lukai unsheathed his dagger, but Kendallen reached out with a staying hand.
Conram's antithesis, she murmured. What?
Daisy glanced at Kendallin before turning back to Garen.
Conram is a fable, Garen explained. An old warning for children against using their Starlock without training. When Conram came into his power, he became so obsessed with reliving his memories in his mind that he couldn't learn to control it. So he relived his youth that way for the rest of his life, growing old without ever truly living another day.
Daisy flinched away.
You saw the same as Kendallin?
Garen hesitated as all eyes turned his way. His noetic skills weren't a secret, but he'd been careful not to use them here among this group. The easiest way to lose people's trust was to delve into their memories without their permission. But now, Kendallin's eyes begged him to speak up, to verify that she wasn't going mad with her assessment. His past... Garen paused, unsure how to explain it. It's all fractured. I've never seen anything like it. He wet his lips, trying to think of what could do this to a person. Who would do this to a person?
Marnock,
Aura muttered.
He's the mirror image of Conram, so he can mirror the name until he remembers his own.
Silmar ignored her.
Can you at least tell who he's been loyal to?
Kendallin shook her head.
There's a mournfulness in these last 2 moons, a sense of being lost. I saw that with clarity, and it lines up with his explanation. But before that, it's like something went through his soul and crushed who he was.
She shuddered.
Maybe it's the result of an inexperienced noetic unsuccessfully trying to erase a memory,
Garen suggested, remembering his own unwieldy attempts during training.
Or an experienced noetic successfully breaking his mind, Veldin muttered.
The others all exchanged horrified looks.
Could Mavis do that? Cyrus asked.
Mavis is a pneumatic, Silmar said. But that doesn't mean she couldn't commission the job.
Didn't you say Emerus was a noetic? Cyrus asked. What if instead of commissioning the job, she used a brand to do it?
The stranger frowned, taking the information in without comment.
We'll discuss this at another time.
Silmar changed the subject so quickly, it felt like a reprimand.
I admit we can't prove him to be the enemy. He saved one of ours, and we saved him, so we owe him nothing. We'll treat him as a guest in our camp for now.
Silmar's eyes swung to Garen. Maybe he had somehow moved up in the ranks with this new stranger beneath him. Or maybe Silmar was simply taking stock of how many enemies he was keeping close rather than setting loose.
We'll take him as far as Eleness, Silmar said, turning back to the stranger. He won't follow us from there.
The stranger slowly nodded his agreement when it became clear Silmar waited for a response.
What about Felk?
The question slipped from Garen's lips before he could think it through. Silmar glanced at him in surprise, then turned to check on the Winix, who was patiently sitting a respectful distance from the camp.
He's shown a commendable loyalty to Eliana,
the old man admitted. Daisy shot Garen a surprised look of appreciation.
It could work in our benefit to have a Winix with us. He showed restraint.
Her hands twisted in her lap while Silmar considered her words. The old man frowned, his scars shifting with his mood.
Very well. He can stay for now, too.
Silmar, Lukai, and Veldin all threw their dinner remains into the fire, suspicion still marking their faces as they left, but Daisy grinned, beckoning Felk over. He sat next to her, his wide grin revealing his dozens of teeth, now full-grown. His body wriggled like that of a child needing to relieve himself. Kendallin studied the stranger as if still parsing out his past.
I know you're telling the truth. It just doesn't make sense.
I wish it made sense to me too, he muttered. Daisy's smile resembled more of a grimace as Kendallin walked away, leaving Garen, Daisy, Aura, Riverin, Cyrus, and the stranger by the fire.
I'm sorry we almost killed you,
Aura said.
But don't give up hope, Marnock.
His eyes brightened.
You think I can get my memories back?
Aura frowned.
I'd hoped Karyne could tune into your past memories and give them back to you.
Her gaze strayed to Karyne, making him feel like a boy caught sneaking in the kitchens for extra cake. Karyne shook his head.
I couldn't make sense of them.
Aura hummed, her brow furrowed in concentration.
It seems more like your soul is lost. If we could piece the memories together, they might provide reference points for you to find yourself, but it also might not be enough. We'd almost need to find a way to piece your soul back together before someone could sift through the essence of who you are.
Karyne winced. Everything about the process sounded painful, especially after tuning in to what was left of the poor man's memory. The man only nodded. In that case, I accept the name. He paused, the hint of a smile on his face. And the apology.
Chapter 57. Aura watched as the others settled into their bedrolls. Home gave Marnock an extra blanket, but Felk denied needing one and volunteered to help with the watch instead. The stranger settled himself several feet away from the others, keenly aware of their distrust. An itch started inside Aura, a nagging sensation that she could help them be better. If they knew who he was and what he'd done, would they treat him differently? If she restored his memories, would that help their mission? His ability to heal went far beyond Lukai's. He could be an asset to their team if they knew. But stirring up his past would be painful. So much loss. She frowned, turning her back on him. Interfering wasn't her way. She couldn't even see the possible paths before him if she interfered, because it was expected that she wouldn't. And yet her throat ached with the held-back offer. Her hands tingled with anticipation. A single touch could restore his past, good and bad, leaving him free to move forward and to deal with the consequences. She clenched her fists and squeezed her eyes shut, refusing the temptation. It wasn't her way. And yet, wasn't that exactly what she'd felt the sun urging her to do by sending Skunk to aid Karyne? Would helping Marnock be a ripple or a stone? She settled under her blanket, watching the stars above, identifying each one by their pattern of dance, until her breathing slowed and her muscles relaxed. Did the stars applaud her self-control? Or was this merely the expectation that she was finally meeting? It shouldn't matter. It only mattered what the sun saw in her. Still, it took a long time for her to get their accusing voices out of her head. Aura played with the braid on her wrist, eyeing the others as they slept. The longer she was with them, the harder it was to focus on her true purpose. Retrieving Eliana's blood and rescuing Emerus was their cause, their fight. But it had become her own. Still, she was supposed to be here for something else. Her attention fell on Eliana once more as the young woman wrapped a protective arm around the large beast who had previously tried to rip out her throat. Even saving the Winnicks and coddling him was something Aura couldn't have factored in. It put Eliana on a new trajectory with different outcomes, some better than before, some far worse. Aura had thought that Karyne was the one who could help her, but now she wondered if it might be Eliana. Or maybe the sun's prophecy had fooled her into thinking it was only one. If Aura was wrong about them, she needed to be ready to sever ties. The thought sliced through her with more dread than she'd anticipated. But Eliana and Karyne were finite. Long after they were gone, Aura would still hunt for the pieces she'd lost. The arrow needed to matter more. She drew the braid to her lips, wishing it still smelled of hyssop and juniper. "I won't fail you," she whispered into the night. Chapter 58. As they drew closer to LNS, Eliana sensed the wary mood brought on by Marnock's and Felk's presence shift back to a relaxed camaraderie. Felk became less of a threat as the new moon approached, and he became an old Winnicks, spending most of his time resting curled up near Eliana's bedroll. Her desire for friendship allowed her to set aside the confusing secrets surrounding her family line. Each night she asked Jasperus for more stories, or begged Lukai and Kendallin to spill each other's childhood memories. Jasperus and Lukai were far more compliant than Kendallin. Their stories gave her and Cyrus a better understanding of Vendaris, even though it didn't change her lack of desire to rule. Marnock never regained his memories, but he formed new ones, discovering his penchant for detail and a great knowledge of the body. They suspected he'd been a healer, and when they tested his skills, it was clear he was a somatic progeny, despite their inability to find a starlock on him. Each night she trained, he'd watched from a distance, occasionally flexing a hand or closing his eyes in concentration, giving Eliana the impression he was learning or relearning right along with her. Finally, Marnock stepped forward, offering slight corrections to Lukai's instructions, bringing Eliana 10 times further in her somatic training with a handful of simple tweaks. Her light shields grew to protect her midsection, then her whole body, and eventually a companion, all without needing threats to motivate her. Even Silmar had trouble hating him after that. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose her memory, to have no recollection of who she was or where she came from. As much as she longed to be rid of her memories of Arvid and Vera, it sounded disconcerting, like a ship without anchor. Karyne even spent time with her, teaching her to use her light shield to stop him from tuning into her memories, or how to defend herself with a dagger. They kept to safer topics, like star speed or Cyrus's theological debates, rather than addressing their complicated history. After 2 weeks, they finally reached the outskirts of LNS. Eliana watched Karyne adjust his pack as she brushed down her horse. He'd be leaving that night for the palace to secure his ship and ask his sister for reinforcements, and he'd be taking Riverin and Marnock with him. He took out almost everything, sorting supplies into piles to be left for the rest of their party. Riverin helped him without comment, the two working in tandem as if they had all their lives. Eliana knew things weren't right between them, but she hadn't ever figured out why. She gave her horse one last pat, then made her way over to Karyne and Riverin. I hear that Aura isn't going with you. She was never really with us. Karyne grinned, the familiar tilt of his lips no longer resembling a smirk. Had his smile changed, or just Eliana's perception of it? She does her own thing, and if it lines up with what we're doing, she'll allow us to participate. Riverin nodded at Eliana before heading toward Lukai with a stash of bandages and medicines. The X on his forehead stood out in the glow of the sun's descent. They'd kept him hidden most of the trip, knowing what other travelers would assume. Would he get a chance to see his wife and baby before joining them on the boat? She supposed Karyne would be eager to see his bondmate as well. Are you offering to take her place? Karyne's question startled Eliana out of her thoughts. Whose place? Aura. Who else? He eyed her strangely. Gullet always likes to have a lady around. Even though there was a teasing tilt to his smile, she shook her head. She toyed with the end of her braid, and his gaze followed the motion. Gullet's probably the only one of you I'll miss, she said. Besides, I'll wait until we have proof that your parents hold no ill will. His grin faded. Either way, I'll be back to help you. I know you don't want my help. Maybe you don't even need it. Not like you used to. He looked away. Eliana's face heated, and she glanced at Felk, curled up next to her bedroll with a hand over his wrinkled face. I didn't mean it when I said that I didn't want your help. I was mad that night. He scanned her face as if evaluating the truth of her words. Either way, I'm with you until we eliminate Mavis as a threat. Eliana envied the confidence in his face, the certainty in his eyes. His goals for justice went far beyond the recreant's plan to save Emerus, or at least the plans she knew of. Sometimes Karyne's eagerness reminded her of Cyrus. Those were the moments where she could think of him as a friend, the moments she wanted to think of him as a friend. Why should the history of their families get to dictate whether or not they could get along? And then what? Her question came out as a whisper, but she knew he heard. His jaw tightened, either holding in his answer or acknowledging that he had none. He pulled out his dagger, turning it and offering her the hilt. I want you to have this. She took a step back and laughed to cover her discomfort. I already have a dagger. He raised his eyebrows, glancing at the clunky dagger sheathed at her hip. Her face heated, both at the way his eyes grazed over her and the truth that her dagger was a sorry excuse for a wieldable weapon. I'd always meant this to be yours, Karyne said. It never seemed like you'd take it before. Or maybe I was worried you'd use it against me. He laughed and ran his free hand through his hair. Eliana couldn't hold back her smile, and, against her will, she found herself reaching for the dagger. It seems like a family heirloom. Hardly something you should pass on to me. No, not an heirloom. His smile turned sad. I had it made for your dedication gift. It's a Vendaran tradition to receive your first weapon at the end of your dedication year. I was only 14. A part of me thought that if I had it made, then I would find you. I'd be able to give it to you." He shrugged and looked away once more, blinking fast. Eliana hadn't meant to keep the dagger, but she could hardly give it back now. Not after he'd shared something like that. She tightened her grip on the hilt, letting the ridges dig into her skin. "Thank you." He unhooked the sheath from his belt and passed that over too, then settled back to sorting supplies as Riverin returned. They were almost done, and then Eliana knew they'd be riding off through the wetlands, approaching their homes. It wasn't a real goodbye. He'd be back the next day, hopefully with news of his ship and reinforcements. But it felt weighted enough that her thank you didn't seem like enough. "May the sun's light always shine upon you." The words fell out quickly, awkwardly, since she was used to the stars' blessing. Both men paused, making Eliana wonder if she'd said it wrong. Was it insulting coming from someone who didn't know what to think about the sun? But then Karyne's gaze met hers, and he reached over and gave her a fierce hug. "And may the stars' light always guide you," he whispered in her ear. He let go before she'd had a chance to process the hug or the words, before she'd had a chance to raise her arms and return the gesture. She scratched at her palm, unsure what else to say, but Karyne had already turned back to the supplies, and in moments, he and Riverin were mounting their steeds. Marnock hopped on the back of Riverin's horse, looking as lost as he had the day they'd found him. Eliana couldn't help feeling sorry for him, wishing they'd been able to help him recover his memories. He hoped to find answers in LNS, but they were all just as afraid of what those answers might be. Aura came close enough to pat the horses and give parting words Eliana couldn't catch, and the others all waved farewell. As soon as the three men disappeared from view, Eliana swapped out her old dagger for Karyne's, testing its light weight against her hip. She couldn't deny it felt better than the old one. She could even pull it out quicker, angling it up and out with just a flick of her wrist. She grinned as she sheathed it once more, thinking more of the man who'd given it to her than the weapon itself. She tried to ignore the fact that Holm headed out soon after the other men, likely to track them and make sure they went where they'd promised to go. But she couldn't pretend Silmar didn't call them to break camp. Several others grumbled, but they all obeyed, even an exhausted Felk. Eliana turned to Iris. "What are we doing?" she asked. "How will they find us?" "That's the point, love." Iris gave a small smile. "We don't want them to be able to report our location if they're not as trustworthy as we hope they are." "But what about Karyne and his ship?" "Holm will watch for their return. If all is well, he'll lead them to our camp." Iris returned to her packing, leaving Eliana to spin Karyne's dagger in her palm, letting the ridges dig into the mark of her bond. She couldn't deny the logic, even though her heart wanted to trust her new friends. Silmar was giving them a chance to prove their loyalty. Iris glanced back at Eliana, reaching a hand out to tug the braid she constantly encouraged Eliana to cut. "Be careful not to let Karyne's presence disrupt your bond." Eliana's face heated. She glanced around before leaning in. "My bond? Karyne and I are barely friends." Iris shrugged and doused the cook fire. "If you say so." Steam and smoke sizzled around them. Eliana's palm itched as she thought about Lukai. They'd become friends, but they'd agreed that was enough for now. Still, she hadn't put much thought into their bond. Not since they'd left as Lara. Not since Karyne had joined them. Lukai came up beside her and placed her pack on her back. Iris gave her a knowing look and went back to rolling up blankets. By the time they'd settled in a more hidden location, the stars were at their dance. Cyrus set up a few feet away from camp to kneel and pray before the stars, and Aura sat on her bedroll, watching him with a slight frown on her face. After getting Felk's weary body settled next to her bedroll, Eliana sat by several others around the fire, eyeing Kendallin and Lukai, who took watch. Maybe Marnock will find someone who recognizes him, Eliana said. Someone who can restore his memory.
Which is exactly why we moved.
Jasperus tapped his temple, grinning at her like a proud grandfather. I would have liked to be around for that, she murmured. See his face shift from confused to peaceful. Maybe figure out where his starlock is.
I'm still not convinced he has a starlock.
Silmar's ever-present frown deepened. Then how did he heal himself using my magic?
I still think that was you.
Silmar eyed her like she might suddenly sprout an extra appendage, one that was capable of far more impressive magic than she was.
Unless he used blood magic.
She held back a groan. Why did it always come back to blood magic? What if he has a starlock and it's disguised like Veldon's? She gestured to Veldon's earrings. Maybe it's a button on his cloak or something on his shoe, and he's not even aware.
It's unlikely, Silmar said. The starlock gives you the greatest strength, the closer it lies to your heart. Only a truly proficient progeny can get away with that trick.
Why, thank you. Veldon beamed, making Silmar grumble something under his breath. Jasperus sat back, his face falling into shadows.
I still want to know what fractured his past.
Silmar hummed his agreement, his gaze settling on the flames. His mind seemed haunted by his own memories as he stroked one of the lumpy scars on his cheek. What kind of injury caused scars like his?
Each person here has been broken in some way.
Veldon's unusually serious tone cut into Eliana's thoughts.
We all made a choice to sacrifice our lives in order to keep Mavis from gaining power.
Eliana nodded, then turned to Jasperus. Yours is the only story I haven't heard. Silmar said it was one I should hear from your own lips. Jasperus grasped his starlock and peered at its axe shape.
He probably thought you weren't ready for it at the time. I was actually a zealot until a year ago, when Mavis took my son for her army.
Eliana flinched. A zealot?
Most zealots start out as loyalists. They want leadership, but they see the corruption of the royal family, so they look to the servants of the sun. As they start to follow Mavis, they're either unaware of Mavis's growing connection with the Elenesses, or they're unaware of Mavis's true motives. My wife and I fell in the second camp.
Eliana swallowed hard. How did she take your son?
In our country, there are 3 major schools where men and women are trained after receiving their starlocks. Technically, we should be registering you as a progeny so you can attend one. One of many laws we're breaking.
He smirked, but it quickly faded. As he spoke, Iris joined them by the fire, her hands busy mending one of Holmes' shirts.
Most recreants hide their starlocks and train at home, Jasperus continued. The schools are technically under the royal family's authority, but Mavis scouts the schools to grow her army, calling students into priesthood, but training them for warfare.
So her army is filled with progenies? Eliana asked. How can we match up against that? With strategy. Veldin toyed with the fishhooks in his ears. She takes those who seem the most powerful, but that doesn't always mean the most skilled. Besides, we have our own progenies. So she chose your son? Eliana asked, turning back to Jasperus.
Yes,
he swallowed, gaze on the fire.
As zealots, we saw it as a privilege. My wife.
His voice broke.
My wife and I were thrilled at his honored status. He moved up in the ranks of priesthood, but he changed so much.
Jasperus's eyes and mouth twitched as he spoke. Silmar turned away, but Veldin gave a sticky pat to Jasperus's back. Iris's hands moved faster with her needle and thread as she blinked away tears.
He changed within a few moons, both in physical strength and power, but his words and thoughts began to change too. He worshipped the ground Mavis walked on. On his last visit home, he finally admitted he'd allowed himself to be branded.
Eliana's chest tightened. Like my mother? Jasperus nodded.
His was voluntary. He wasn't under her control often, but it still left us on edge to know he could be at any time, especially when he hinted at the use of blood magic. Few people outside our army know or believe that rumor to be true. It's why the royal family is so eager to work with her, even though they swear off all blood magic.
Eliana's gaze drifted to the blackness of the woods, her eyes imagining the trail Karyne might follow. He would tell them about Mavis's blood magic. What would they do about it?
Before he returned to his duties, my wife questioned him about the brand. She asked if he could undo it, and he completely lost it. He threw her against the wall. I was so concerned about her that I didn't even see him leave, and I haven't seen him since.
And your wife? Eliana whispered.
She died 2 days later from her internal injuries.
The air grew heavy with his loss laid bare. I'm so sorry. The words tasted stale on her lips.
She begged me to forgive him. He's just another victim. I think I have. But some days it's hard to remember. Some days I have to work through it all over again. And I don't always have the strength.
He wiped at the wetness clinging to his lashes. What's your son's name? Eliana asked.
Brogden.
Jasperus's voice cracked as he added,
After his grandfather.
Silence stretched out for a long moment. And he still serves Mavis? Jasperus nodded.
He will until he dies, which will likely be soon. As long as Mavis has brands, she'll be too powerful. Taking out her brands will make her vulnerable, and we need her to be vulnerable.
Fresh horror washed over Eliana. How many brands does she have? And how many of them would have to be killed? Eliana and her mother might be safe in that plan, but at the cost of how many others? Maybe not many, Iris said. If we can cut out their brands, they could be spared. Jasperus's jaw clenched.
Unlikely, considering they're all under her control.
Eliana bit her lip. And there's nothing that can help? Durican let me cut his out. Silmar hummed.
True. That's a unique circumstance. I think it's because stopping you in any way could have killed you, and that conflicted with the orders he'd received from Mavis.
She'd suspected the same, but what Silmar saw as a fluke, Eliana saw as an opportunity. If there had been a way around it with Durican, why couldn't there be a way around it with someone else? What about a bond? Could my desire for Lukai's safety override her control over me as a brand? Iris looked up, her eyes apologetic. Bondmates don't command each other the way brands do. It's not as powerful, even if it's more powerful on a deeper level. Silmar stared into the fire, stroking his beard, but he said nothing.
I'd bond myself to Brogdon if I thought it could help. I'd do anything to pull him out of her control. But a brand is far more powerful.
Jasperus twisted his starlock in his hands once more.
You know, his starlock is identical to mine, both in the shape of an axe. Neither of us knew the meaning when he left. I expect it's how one of us will die. Maybe both of us. I still love him, but I'll throw that axe myself if it means protecting our people from that blood witch.
The image left Eliana reeling, but the words were spoken with an air of confession that she couldn't ignore. Thank you for telling me your story. He nodded, and they all sat in somber silence for a few moments before taking turns heading for bed. Eliana checked on Felk, whose rattled breathing left her anxious. Did some Winnicks die from old age before the cycle was complete? She lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep, worrying whether Felk would survive, whether Silmar would tolerate him in his child state again, whether Felk would still want to be with them after his memories were gone. When she tried to distract herself by thinking of Jasperus's story, it only left her more distraught. In many ways, it had been Jasperus's way of warning her. If he was willing to sacrifice his son for the greater good of the people, he would do no less with her. Maybe she wasn't as safe as she'd thought. If she became one of Mavis's brands, Jasperus wouldn't hesitate to kill her for the greater good. She couldn't decide if she was concerned or grateful. I hope you enjoyed listening to this first installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. To get reminders for new episodes and to stay up to date with my books, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at KarynNorton.com. You'll also get the prequel short story to Blood of the Stars in ebook and audio for free. Thanks so much for listening.